Well, Mr. Steiner, thank you very much for joining us here at Doha Forum and welcome back. The United Nations Development Programme this week launched its Human Development Report 2019. Talk us through some of the headlines from that report.
Well, the theme of the 2019 Human Development Report is inequalities in the 21st century, and what we try to explore is how do we reconcile a world that in statistical terms, in averages, generally when you describe it through economic indicators, is actually doing quite well. We live in an era where the world is richer than ever before and where people live longer, so why do we have all these protests coming? Why are people going out on the streets and generally questioning the model, or at least the choices that people have made over the last 10 to 20 years? And the report comes to a conclusion that it is beyond income. It is not just about money. It is about other things as well. And it is also not just explainable in averages, because you can always say, look, GDP is growing and everybody will be better off because per capita GDP has grown in a country. That masks the fact that people are being left behind. And that is what we refer to as the 20th century inequalities, access to education, health, and inequalities that we have indeed reduced. And in that sense, development is a success story, but not for everyone. And increasingly, as we enter a new century, the 21st century, the report also points to two very significant seismic shifts that could make inequalities much worse if not addressed properly. The advent of new technologies, the digital economy on the one hand, and climate change.
And staying with inequality, there's a 2016 World Bank report that found that inequality declined for the first time since the 19th century. Do you see that progress as being sustainable?
Well, sustainable in an environmental sense, clearly not, because the story of the 20th century, and again the Human Development Report has a wonderful graph that shows how human development increases, but also the ecological footprint. That model of essentially mining nature or the environmental resources in order to drive economic development has reached its limits. And it is not just pollution, it's not just climate change, it's water resources, fertile soils, land. We know that already, and that's why we are beginning to see this transition towards a greener, a more sustainable economy, driving increasingly traditional decision making. We may be seeing inequalities shrink, but we are now 7 billion people, and too many people feel that they're either losers in this equation that has driven development decision making, the debates about globalization just being one example, and particularly young people are feeling increasingly worried about the future. Do I have a future in employment? Do I have a job in this changing economy? And what is climate change going to do to me and my life when I see today's decision makers seemingly unable to take the right decisions that need to be taken? So people are getting worried, and therefore they're stepping out onto the streets.
Now, towards tackling inequality and poverty, how do you assess the success of policymakers in converting talk and political attention into actual action with tangible outcomes?
If you take a long-range view, then you first of all should recognize that the story of development over the last 200 years, 250 years, is a remarkable success story. We live today at the beginning of the 21st century in an economy where connectivity, interaction, access to information are without precedent. But, and I think this is where the challenge comes, the model of development that on the one hand was based on a very extractive model of the resources that the planet provides, but also a very wasteful economy. And I think therein lies the challenge of, in China, for instance, that transition is being described under a paradigm of moving towards an ecological transition. And in Europe, we now see a Green Deal emerge. And I think these are expressions of having to reinvent the economic model of development in a far more sustainable manner for the 21st century.
Is the world witnessing a decrease in multilateralism, and how does that affect the work that you do?
I think one of the things we need to acknowledge is that multilateralism is both a vision, a very powerful idea born out of the catastrophe of the Second World War, in order to make the world more resilient, to acknowledge that nations are not united, but actually are defined very often in their relationships by their differences. But the United Nations is an effort to bring nations together because they have differences and find ways of resolving that difference. Multilateralism is what, in essence? It's an expression of trying to avoid conflict as a way of resolving different interests. And multilateralism is, at the end of the day, a product of nations willing to work under common rules, the rule of law, norms that allow us to resolve and address challenges without falling apart.
Absolutely. And you mentioned multipolarity there. Now, would a multipolar world make the efforts of the UNDP more of a challenge? Does it ease your work? What's your interpretation there?
It makes it more diverse. I mean, we are the development program of the United Nations, and interesting enough, some would say, well, that's a kind of business that is ending, isn't it? Because when you have eradicated poverty and development is happening, there is no more need for a development program of the United Nations. I would argue differently. Development is a continuous process. It is economic, it is about infrastructure, but it's also about policies that address equity or inequalities. What we're also working with is, what does it mean to try and develop a economy of the future against the backdrop of digitalization, of automation, artificial intelligence. Development is a continuous calibration of different opportunities, challenges, and citizens in countries also change their view of what matters, what is important. Fairness, dignity, equity, opportunity are, in a sense, the tests that people are applying to their national development models, and others come with low inflation, GDP growth, per capita income. And these two conversations need to meet, otherwise we will see more of what we've seen in recent months, which is people become angrier, frustrated, they look to the streets rather than the institutions of our democracies to actually transact their differences.
Your message was that despite those frustrations, we still saw progressive policy making. We still saw a reaffirmation of multilateralism. Obviously, multilateralism being up for debate. Can you just reiterate that message?
Well, on the back of a very difficult conference of the parties in Madrid that is trying to address, raising ambitions on climate action against a backdrop of, the biggest historical emitting nation actually taking a step back from the Paris Agreement, obviously challenges people's imagination. But let me try and explain very briefly why I look to the climate story as an immense success story of multilateralism, which is not obvious when you watch the painful conferences. First of all, 30 years ago, it was the UN that helped to establish the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was a protective custody platform, so to speak, for scientists to be able to bring to the world's attention what was happening in the atmosphere, and even under conditions of imperfect knowledge, to alert the world to this challenge. We have since turned to the IPCC year after year as a way of being able to validate the science that then drives policy making. A process began whereby the United Nations brings together every year every country in the limelight of public attention to both build a consensus but also let the public see which countries and how slow countries are sometimes willing to address a real existential threat. Nations are not united. That's why they come together and they try to resolve their differences. And right now, on the climate change front, we are back in seeing polarities emerge that are a great threat to the future of our capacity to act on multilateralism. The UN has always been a driver of progressive thinking, of addressing issues before maybe individual member states as a whole are ready to do so. In that sense, the pioneering role of the UN, I think, is one that is more important than ever in the domain of climate change. But without any complacency, that is fundamental to progress, but we are also obviously having to re-examine all the time, are the processes, are the institutions, are the way that we try to convene the world working.
The UN turns 75 next year. How do you see the organization evolving to remain as effective as it can be?
I think three things are, in a sense, going to inform that discussion. The first one is, can we, in the current political context, rediscover the ingenuity of the idea of the United Nations? Because I think sometimes it's easy to forget why it was established after the Second World War. Also the lessons we learned from the First World War and the League of Nations and the failure of multilateralism then. These are elements of pragmatic design, and we need to ask ourselves, are they still valid and should they continue? The second conversation clearly has to be, are the institutions that we have built around the idea of the UN still valid in the terms of their design, their mandates, but also in the way they function? And thirdly, is the world ready to recognize that unless the member states of the United Nations own the project of multilateralism, we will not be able to function effectively? At the end of the day, the UN can only be a mirror image of a world's willingness to work with norms and standards, the international rule of law, and also a degree of accountability beyond the national borders of a nation. And I think that is always a difficult debate, and I think it is one that on the occasion of the 75th anniversary, is precisely the kind of dialogue the Secretary General is seeking with a world population of 7 billion people.
Mr. Steiner, thank you very much.
Thank you.